How does the state of Kansas fund itself? Who pays and where does the money go? Here's everything you need to know about the Kansas budget crisis. Kansas runs on over $15 billion a year. $4 billion comes from the federal government, $5 billion from things like college tuition, lottery tickets, and fuel tax. Then there's over $6 billion raised and spent by the state general fund. This is the main budget. It's the money the governor and legislature have discretion over. Let's take a closer look. Here's the general fund over 25 years. The green line is revenue, the black line is expense, and the bottom bar shows our ending balance each year. In 2001, you see how a small economic recession diminished revenue and depleted the ending balance. Kansas rebounded before being hit by the Great Recession in 2008. Kansas was experiencing an excellent recovery from the Great Recession, then 2013 hit. What happened? Revenue plummeted and the ending balance is gone. It looks identical to a recession, but it isn't. The state general fund is predominantly funded by income tax and sales tax. Income tax is a progressive tax, meaning that it's supposed to put the burden on the rich. Sales tax is a regressive tax, meaning it predominantly puts the burden on the poor. Here you see the revenue sources of the state general fund. And now we can get a better idea of what happened in 2013. Revenue from income taxes dropped nearly $1 billion per year. It wasn't an accident. It's called the Kansas experiment, and it's defined by two features. One is a large income tax break. The other is called the shot of adrenaline. It was an idea that if businesses, specifically limited liability companies, were completely tax exempt, that they would create unprecedented job growth. But the reality was actually job growth declining, and it's now negative. Looking farther back at tax rates, one defining feature is the constant increase in sales tax. Kansas is a rare state that charges the full rate on food, and now it's the highest tax in the state. I can't tell you what fairness is. That's between you and your faith. But I can tell you that over the last several years, Kansas has been doing a massive redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. Here's what that looks like. This is how much of your entire income goes to state and local taxes. The Kansas experiment tax shift meant the poor pay more and the rich pay less. Everything the middle class gained in income tax breaks, it lost in sales tax increases. The difference between the rich and poor went from roughly 3% to 7%. Making Kansas one of the most regressive tax systems in the nation. It wasn't always this way. Kansas once led the nation in progressive economics. In 1933, they formed a state income tax with a top tax bracket for income over $250,000 a year. Brackets are set at a dollar amount, so they shrink over time with inflation. In 77, you see the top bracket again was above $200,000, but in 88 it collapsed to two brackets. A policy quickly abandoned until it returned in the 2013 Kansas experiment. Today there are two brackets, one for families near or in poverty and the other for everyone else. So what does Kansas do with tax revenue anyway? Here's the general expenses. About 4% for general government, 6% for public safety, 27% for human services like the Department of Health, 12% for higher education, and like every single state, most of our tax dollars go to K through 12 education. If you're wondering where transportation is, remember it's over here in the all funds under other, because the Kansas Department of Transportation is mostly funded by restricted revenue like fuel tax. There isn't a perfect way to talk about education funding, because depending who's reporting the number, it changes. There's a sort of budget report gamesmanship that's created a rhetorical paradox. The governor has said education funding is at record levels, and that's technically true. However, that's because they changed what they consider education. Looking at state aid per pupil, we get a different truth. One of education funds diminishing, and now the Supreme Court of Kansas has ruled the state is unconstitutionally underfunding schools. When you pierce through the smoke and mirrors of the Kansas budget, you find some things that no one talks about, namely the massive amount of debt we're in. States must balance budgets, but they can still go into debt. It's healthy when it's used for infrastructure, but recently the states used highway bonds like credit cards to mask the Kansas experiment. This is the interest on that debt. In 1992, CAPERS, the state's retirement system, was fully funded, but the state started skimping on its payments, building up huge sums of unfunded pension liabilities. Let's go back to revenue versus expense and add the 2017 and 2018 estimates. The yearly deficit's gotten a lot bigger, and the state's been using all sorts of maneuvers to get by each year. For budget year 2017, which ends June 30th, there's a deficit around $840 million. They plugged it by taking $260 million from the highway fund, over $100 million from other programs and funds, continued to delay $115 million into CAPERS from last year, didn't even pay this year's fourth quarter of CAPERS, didn't pay $75 million into K-12 education, and took 75% of the money in the pooled money investment fund. All of this in 2017 extended the state's long-term obligations by another $500 million. Budget year 2018, which begins July 1st, has a near $1 billion deficit to start, and once we add in the $150 million plus needed to constitutionally fund K-12 education, the deficit is over $1 billion. In 2018, the governor plans the same taking of highway funds, even more delays to paying CAPERS, and finishing off the pooled money investment fund. And even after all that, there'd still be a $300 to $400 million deficit in 2018. After exhausting the pooled money fund, the state has no more assets that can be easily turned into cash, meaning the behavior of the last few years is literally impossible to continue. The state is likely at the most financially unstable point since the Great Depression, and even a minor recession could be devastating, which leads Kansas to this reality. It's not a question of if Kansas needs revenue, it's a question of who will pay. There are two options: continue taxing the poor through increases in sales tax, fees, and utility rates, or end the Kansas experiment tax breaks. An all-out repeal would raise $1 billion, which is just shy of covering the deficit. This year, a bill covering half the deficit passed, but was vetoed by the governor and then fell just 3 Senate votes shy of override. The legislature is discussing plans that would only cover 35 to 55% of the deficit, and mostly rely on the same highway sweeps and CAPERS delays. Essentially, every dollar Kansas doesn't raise today, it will have to raise $2 in the future. This all gets worse next budget year because most of the delayed payments and debts are scheduled to start in 2019, right after the governor leaves. In just a few short years, Kansas went from a near $1 billion surplus to a yearly $1 billion deficit. They shifted the tax burden onto the poor, exhausted emergency revenue sources, and accumulated a massive amount of debt, and now must claw its way out of this hole. Be sure to contact your state representative and senator to let them know your thoughts. Congratulations, you probably now know more about Kansas finances than your legislators. I'm in a debt, pun intended, of gratitude to the State House librarians, researchers, and economists for their wealth of knowledge and assistance. And a big thank you to everyone who donates making these productions possible.